Dear audience, welcome to this third session of the session 3 that we have called High Tide for Arctic Preparedness. We have a little time, so I'll give a short introduction. So we know that the new geopolitical situation with increased international competition and maybe reduced cooperation, in addition to all the challenges we already know very well, climate change, increased economic and commercial interest in the Arctic, increased human presence. It's a kind of a tidal wave where the changes are happening so fast and need to be solved faster and faster on a shorter and shorter time horizon. So Arctic societies need to build total preparedness and increased resilience to address all these kind of tidal forces. And that requires new multidisciplinary thinking and research across disciplines. And research that can mobilize all parts of social economy, building knowledge across authorities, industry, and the civil society, including people's values and trust in societal functions, democracy, and institutions. So we have addressed this high tide for Arctic preparedness in 2 previous sessions already this morning. This third session has, originally it was 6, now it has 4 presentations. 2 presentations from the US Coast Guard had to cancel their participation this time. But the talks we are going to listen to in this third session is about maritime security threats. It's focused on governance, on critical infrastructure, hybrid threats, and surveillance technologies. So it's very much related to the maritime domain, or marine domain. And the session is put together by research advisors at the Research Council of Norway, together with well-reputed scientists abroad. And physically present here today, my name is Jon Børre Ørbekk. I am a special advisor in polar and ocean research at the Research Council in Norway. My colleague Anne Vincent Grødland here. She is advisor at the Department for Democracy and International Relations. And our 2 highly reputed scientists in the session committee is Philip Steinberg. He's sitting there too. He's a professor in political geography at the Durham University and is also UArctic chair in political geography. And Melody Brown-Burkins in the front row here. She is a adjunct professor of environmental studies at Dartmouth. And she's also director of the Institute for Arctic Studies there. And she's also UArctic chair in science, diplomacy, and inclusion. So they are very relevant for this topic. Well, the first talk today will be from Alexander Dalziel. He is at the MacDonald-Laurier Institute in Canada. He has been working on geopolitics for many years in the government and also in Canada's national security, foreign policy, and defense community, and also in civil society. And you will give, Alexander, a talk that you have called Russian Infrastructure, Grand Strategy, and Maritime Security in the Arctic Ocean. Welcome to the floor.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much to the organizers for this invitation. It's indeed a great pleasure to have the chance to speak today at such a widely reputed event as the Arctic Frontiers. And I believe at a point where, of course, Arctic geopolitics, security are being talked about for the most probably in decades. So I'm going to give a little bit of a discussion. Let me get the technology working here. Should say that's a photo I took from Kirkenes earlier last year. So that's about as close as I've gotten to the Russian border and looking out towards the Barents Sea. So I'm just going to do a discussion here about work I've been doing on Russian grand strategy in the Arctic. So the goals of the presentation give you a little bit of a sense of how Russian civilian investments in the Arctic are interacting with Russian geostrategy, its geopolitical intentions, capacity for hybrid warfare, gray zone activities in the Arctic Ocean region and at sea. So I want to consider this a little bit through the lens of maritime security scholarship, in particular through that of Christian Bugge from the University of Copenhagen and some of his co-authors, and then explore the question a little bit through looking at some of the findings that the Russian grand strategy in the Arctic project has made. So I should say that overall most of my work is not theoretical. It's based on empirical studies of issues. It's public facing. It aims to inform public policy as opposed to necessarily contribute to the scholarly discussion. But I do take these opportunities to look at some of the literature and think about it to try to draw out some of the larger context of what I'm doing and how the big questions like state, civilian security, how they interact. And this is, and I will add just maybe here up front, happy afterwards to answer questions about Canada. Nothing really here is very specific to Canada, but that issue of the relationship between civilian infrastructure, defense infrastructure, and overall security, socioeconomic development is a very, very live discussion in Canada, and happy to discuss that further. So the Russian Grand Strategy in the Arctic project is one we've been working on at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for about 2 years, based on funding from the United States European Command. We've basically, the major focus of it is to use Russian language sources. And as many of you in your research may, be aware, if you look at a lot of media, this projection of interests on foreign actors, I think is one of the big challenges we still face, in discussing challenges. So, statements in lead up to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, it's not in Russia's interest to do this. Well, much of the Russian Grand Strategy in the Arctic project aims to look at, well, what in fact is the Russian leadership saying that its interests are, as opposed to trying to rationalize what those are from a distance. So that has let me look into a few different types of discourses. The ones I'll talk about today mostly are looking at wide constellations of Russia's strategic documents, the documents that are coming out of the Kremlin, coming out of the Russian government, but also looking at other sectors in the series on social and traditional media, expert institutional Russian sources, basically all the different components in the Russian discussion of these issues pertaining to the Arctic. So the project looks at multiple angles of Russian presence in the Russian discussion and policy in the Arctic, aspects of decision making. Some of the papers have looked at, for instance, Russia's Arctic governors and how they play a role in building relations with China, looking at their social media pronouncements, et cetera, as a way to do that, looking at Russian media sources and how they discuss the North American Arctic as a defense, security, geopolitical concept. And upcoming papers are going to certainly even have a more maritime focus, but for instance, looking at decision-making, who influences Russian policy-making beyond the president and his, President Putin and his immediate circle. So the maritime theme has been pretty strong throughout these. The first two papers were about the Northern Sea Route, also about Russian seabed, or about seabed resources and Russian grand strategy in the Arctic. And the next round is going to look extensively at some of the instruments of civilian power, or in some cases even almost paramilitary, the Russian Coast Guard, which, as you may be aware, is part of the Federal Security Bureau, FSB's border service, Rosatomflot, basically the nuclear icebreaker wing, looking at Russian fisheries, trying to place these in the context of Russian strategic thinking. What are some of the goals? How are they describing them from national security perspectives, power projection perspectives, et cetera here. So today I'm going to talk mostly about the NSR, the seabed, but I wanted to start off, and also a little bit by the intern that I had for the first round, a PhD student at University of Helsinki, John Kay, on some of Putin's attitudes towards the Arctic. But before I do that, I thought I'd just take a moment here to look a little bit at some of the scholarly work that I mentioned earlier. So, and if there's any Danes in the audience, please forgive my pronunciation, but Christian Bugge has been one of the main voices, I think, on maritime security. And with a number of co-authors, he's written extensively on two aspects that I want to pick up here today. So one is on the concept of maritime security, which was treated in a book in 2024 that he and his co-author Edmonds put out. And then a series of papers that he has done with co-authors on infrastructure and how that fits into geopolitical conceptions. So, you know, if you look at the view that's articulated in understanding maritime security, Booger talks a lot about the frameworks, you know, the interaction, again, of geopolitical, national security, economic interests, and infrastructure. You know, I think many of us who look at geopolitical, you know, often think in terms of hard state power capacities, typically military, you know, maybe diplomacy, et cetera. But of course, you know, that's certainly not a wide enough lens to understand that. And I think Booga's work, you know, does give us a more sophisticated sense of the multiplicity of actors, the different functions of those actors that they carry out in the maritime space, and lets us think a little bit about soft power, sharp power, smart power, other ways of looking at advancing state interests in any given space. So the sharp and the smart certainly come out in the way that Booga and Edmonds look at issues in in understanding maritime security. It's very state-centric. They say that, you know, states, and I quote, "States are the most important actors in maritime security," and they go on to say, "A significant spectrum of obligations and responsibilities are part of that state role." A lot of that has to do with UNCLOS, and since the 1980s, you know, creating a whole network of safety, policing, management, protection of exclusive economic zones, EEZs, as well as regulation and inspection of maritime traffic. And we also have, you know, other dimensions of maritime security, such as blue crime, as it's referred to, so organized crime, poaching, these sorts of activities, counterterrorism, and, you know, geopolitically significant protecting trade routes. So one point they make is that, you know, maritime spaces are, in fact, you know, one of the areas where interstate competition expresses itself most frequently. They do contend that interstate conflicts, and again here I quote, "Interstate conflicts will continue to occupy a central place in the maritime security agenda." And interesting, I think, for looking at civilian power is that they say, quote, "Maritime disputes tend to involve the less frequent use of military force than their equivalents on land." And I think that's, you know, again, the diversity of tools here is something that I've been trying to get at in the Russian case. They too talk more about gray zone than necessarily hybrid threats. They define those as, quote, "coercive actions by states or their proxies which avoid the overt or attributable use of military force and so fall below the threshold of outright war." And these, again, to quote, "are for tactical or strategic gain while avoiding the costs of a military confrontation." So these are political, and I think that's the key point to keep in mind. These are political drivers that fall behind them, and that are, you know, the responsibility of the analysts to try to discern those when they apply. So they do give a framework for understanding volatility at sea and volatility of disagreements. One point they make is that, you know, if they have significant functional or symbolic value, that has a direct impact on how much volatility they have. So they identify three different levels of severity: competing territorial claims, nonviolent disputes where states contest each other's claims, and then militarized disputes. And they point out that hybrid gray zone type activities blur these distinctions. And I think that'll be important for as we discuss this today. So then let's speak a little bit about the infrastructure piece. So they articulate what a couple of different, you know, this is still a field in IR from the reading I've done that's developing. Some call it objectual IR, not object. That can sound like it's a, you know, you can object to it, which I'm sure lots of people do, or infrastructuralism. So these are ways to concretize and look at almost interobjective research about the effects of constellations of infrastructure and how those affect global politics. So he and his co-author, Jan Stockbrugger, sharpen that concept of object. They offer a definition that, quote, "An object is defined as a delineated socio-material entity that presents a problem specific enough to necessitate a governmental response." They go on to add that these objects have what they call structuring effects and that they are never static or complete. They cannot be used, this basically, offers a way to not reduce, international relations discussions to mental constructs. I mean, these are very palpable pieces of infrastructure, could be ports, could be subsea cables. Importantly, they also, would give objective status to things like pieces of scientific knowledge, things that, institutional structures such as a Coast Guard or a set of laws. But these objects, in that sense, give, what they call patterns and structures and coherence. So, and that's where an object transcends to being infrastructures with that coherence. So in infrastructuralism, they lay out that, one key part here is that they maintain, fix, and stabilize fluid and ever-changing international relations. These infrastructures underpin, create, and maintain structures of international politics and provide, quote, the necessary foundation for all forms of behavior, interactions, and practices. Again, this notion of structuring effects is one I'm going to bring up a couple of times because I think it's quite useful in thinking about the Russian context. So I'll move to the next slide. And this is where I thought I would maybe frame this. This is not expressly work on maritime security, but John Kay, the intern I mentioned, did some work looking at the history, kind of current history, of President Putin's remarks about the Arctic, any themes we could identify over the last decade or so, basically since the first part of the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. So John identified three different themes that are recurrent in Putin's public statements. One is the harmonious Arctic, the second is a dual-edged security rhetoric, and three is Putin as caretaker of the North. I'll just spend a little bit of attention on these because I think they do flesh out a little bit of the socio-economic and then public rhetorical dimensions of what Russia is up to here. So on harmonious Arctic, John pointed out that Russian presidential discourse on the Arctic is typically optimistic about the state's ability to reach ambitious goals for regional development, even when priorities seem to be in conflict. So examples of this, there's heavy rhetoric on environment, local, indigenous. For instance, in remarks in 2019, Putin spoke of the, quote, development of these territories, the Arctic, is of critical importance both for the global economy and for the global environmental situation. And he went on to add, the main priorities must remain the protection of fragile Arctic ecosystems and support of indigenous peoples. However, Putin's statements almost never make reference to the potential environmental impacts of increased shipping and other activities along the NSR. His comments tend to focus generally on the colossal scale of the Northern Sea route and its potential to generate prestige, prosperity for Russia and Russians. The dual-edged security rhetoric has been a constant over the last decade. It's basically Putin's two minds, is how John puts this. It's a series of rhetorical claims about Russia being ready in the Arctic, but constantly being under threat. And there's a good quote that kind of captures this. This is from 2016, so we have almost 10 years here. That quote, as of today, Putin says, we are stronger than any potential aggressor in the Arctic, any of them. At the same time, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that if we ourselves relax even for a minute or permit a single significant failure in the modernization of the Army or Navy in the training of troops, that situation could change very quickly. Finally, a little bit about Putin as caretaker of the North. This is, typical of an authoritarian state, a sort of personalized politics. A close reading of Putin's rhetoric on this dimension of Arctic policy shows a strategy for dealing with local communities in supporting development of extractive industries and security infrastructure that the state envisages for the region. And I'll come back to this in the subsequent slides. Making significant investments to promote settlement and development, concern with demographic issues. Putin has presented these as vital to the nation's economic and security growth. And one good example from the paper was on indigenous rights. So in a 2017 remark, Putin states, we must never forget the interests of the small indigenous peoples of the North. This is an extremely important issue. Their traditional economic interests and so on must not be violated. But then he immediately goes on to say, and if something inevitably comes into conflict with the implementation of major national projects, then without a doubt, measures for compensation and substitution must be provided. So, as John argues in the paper, that gives some sense of where these actually sit, in priorities, that they will be overridden in the name of a very a central state economic model. So to connect this back to Bugger and Edmonds and some of what we heard there, strong symbolic resonance. I think that's important to keep in mind for the Russian leadership and Russians of the Arctic, and the increasing narrative of economic significance for the regime elites attempting to connect those social economic development and demographic functions. So the next slide, I thought, is very quickly state, what is it that the Russians, Putin and his government actually kind of claim as core maritime goals and interests. And while these could be quite diverse in a number of ways, for the discussion today, two of them are core. One is the exclusive economic zone, EEZ, in relation to the Northern Sea route, and Russia's Central Arctic Ocean extended continental shelf claims. So both of these have to do, again, with a changing environment, particular pieces of UNCLOS, for instance, Section 234 on ice-covered areas, where, Russia has basically been, under UNCLOS, even in an EEZ, you have rights of innocent passage, between 12 miles and 200 miles. And this is something that Russia looks to be contesting when it comes to the Northern Sea route, arguing that it has rights over access for innocent passage for anyone, well, that there is no innocent passage. Also then UNCLOS Article 76, which deals with extended continental shelf claims. This isn't about the water columns, this is about the sea floor, ocean floor beyond the 200-mile limit based on science. If you can show the science, then basically the UN CLCS gives grounds for then states to go negotiate on those terms to move forward. So, that fits in with a very strong emphasis in the Russian strategic documents around continental shelf. So to get back to the Bugger and Edmonds kind of commentary about levels of severity, well, I think here we definitely see, competing territorial claims when it comes to the Arctic Ocean. Canada and Denmark have overlapping claims when it comes to this with Russia, and typically nonviolent disputes where states contest each other in the EEZ and NSR. So both the United States, I contend China, do not actually fundamentally agree with Russia's position on this. China certainly is willing to indulge the Russians quite extensively at the current moment, but this is, a reading of international law that certainly is contentious at the very least. So that creates the space for the gray zone and hybrid activities, and the motivation to create infrastructure to assert and stabilize that regime, that order that that the Kremlin would like to advance. Maybe I'll just linger here for 1 second just to talk a little bit about justifications for hybrid warfare in this context. A lot of time is spent on, obviously the necessity, because these things become legal issues often in domestic contexts, of proof and evidence. And while not wanting in any way to say that's wrong, that's a feature, not a bug of our legal systems, it is worth pointing out that, in some ways it's not mysterious what the Russians are up to here, that, in their strategic documents, they do fully acknowledge that the use of force in international relations and Russia's right to respond asymmetrically to what they see as hybrid warfare being conducted against them. So reciprocity is something important to keep in mind in here. That's in documents like the National Security Strategy, Maritime Doctrine, et cetera, where they make a series of statements about the use of Russian power that are rather consistent, I think, with unattributable activities, asymmetric activities, and Russia's right to use them. So I'll take spend a little bit of time here talking about the two of the other key papers, on the Northern Sea route first, and then on the seabed. So these show different aspects of what Russia's up to in the relationship to infrastructure. The core of the argument around the Northern Sea route in my reading of Russian strategic documents is that it's about building an infrastructure backbone. And there's a few different points I can unfold about this. It's about access, infrastructure, and national security. The NSR is supposed to support all of these, and there's a very clear political and geopolitical set of objectives beneath it. So part of it is about governance, about access for governance, about getting to difficult to reach locations in the Russian Federation, which are quite extensive between the Bering Strait and the Bay of Ob. This is partly to get to the communities there for various well, for supply as well as governance, also for economic development, state control, societal security. They speak about low population geostrategic territories. That's a formulation that they use in some of the strategic documents. So as well as getting to these difficult to reach places, a lot of it has to do with getting to difficult to reach resources from the north. So we often focus on the transoceanic piece. That's probably a little bit of a bias we have in the West. A lot of what Russia is actually up to is to get natural resources out of the north, get them to their markets elsewhere, and harnessing the hinterland, not just this extent of seaway, but also the watershed of the Northern Sea route extending into Siberia to create a cargo base for the Northern Sea route. That's a huge task. Russian documents point to the fact that much of the mineral wealth, hydrocarbon wealth, is in unfavorable geographic conditions and will need new technologies to access. So maybe I'll just quickly say here that the national security piece almost comes up continually in ideas like these kind of mineral energy resource centers, basically natural resource towns, where not only will there be the technology for extraction and export, but also of state governance, and particularly those of the national security services, such as the FSB, the military, and other state forces. There's also space dimensions and digital dimensions to this that I won't linger on here too much. So the seabed piece, is much more about the continental shelf. Certainly seabed mining is seen as a more longer-term example. And maybe this is just where I'll jump a little bit to talk about the science piece here. If the Russian documents basically, look at 2035 onwards as more potential for seabed mining in the Arctic, and I mean, that's probably optimistic, certainly if you're talking about the central Arctic Ocean. I mean, will the claims be settled? Even if they are, the conditions are still going to be extremely difficult for that, should it be something that, well, anyways, Russia might pursue by its own initiatives. But a lot of it right now is about science and increasing the level of knowledge, geologic knowledge of the bases of the seabed, of the Gackel Ridge, of other features there, in order to understand the Arctic better. This is something they're doing in cooperation with China as a way to develop that relationship. So building this knowledge base, is explicitly put in the context of foreign policy interests. And maybe I'll just read a quick quote here from the Mineral Energy Resources Strategy, that the objectives are, quote, raising the level of the geological knowledge base of the Russian Federation's territory and continental shelf, providing for the geopolitical interests of the Russian Federation in the sphere of geological study. So science is a very, very important part to this and part of the, framework for moving onwards with those plans. So next steps, as I mentioned, looking more at coast guarding, ice breaking, fisheries, a little bit more of to look at some of these state assets and how they play a role. Just maybe as a quick hint, looking at the Russian Coast Guard, the explicit reference in Russian documents to its role in defending continental shelf infrastructure, at one time framed more as counterterrorism, and then in current context more against hybrid warfare and those sorts of activities. I'm being warned here, it's the end. So I have a whole bunch of conclusions. Happy you could ask me questions about those. Maybe the two, I'll just see if I can take 30 seconds here, is around the gateway politics, because I think this is primarily what the Russians are up to. I haven't spoken to it much, comes out certainly in a couple of the other papers, but cooperation with non-Arctic states and really asserting Russia as the gateway to the greater Arctic is part of what Russia is trying to do to position itself to take advantage of the space. And this, I think this isn't just Russian. I mean, I think it is part of the interest in general, is kind of upping the Arctic region's geoeconomic status. Certainly the contradiction in Russian policy, it's harder for them to develop the Arctic while they're waging war in Ukraine, but the war in Ukraine has made the Arctic more essential to Russia and these goals. And if you look at certain trends in whether it's critical minerals, technology, other parts of energy politics, the Russians are certainly looking to raise the importance of the Arctic and its economic offer to the world. Maybe it's a follow-up question about the buy-in from others, but they're certainly dangling that offer. few other comments there. Happy to pick those up in the questions afterwards. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Is there a question from the audience? Maybe you heard me. Do you have a question?
I can repeat the question if you wish. If you tell me.
I can also, no, I can also say it. I was wondering if you can share also some impact on the society, like the people itself, of the Russian maritime strategy, security strategy, the impact that it has on the people that live in the coastal areas, mainly.
Well, I certainly think when we talk about security issues, having the broader lens around, environmental impacts, I think this is one of the big areas of concern. The point up here about the erosion of international maritime law, you look at what's being moved along the Northern Sea route, particularly between Russia and China, is oil in many cases. So we see fewer number of ships that, the Shadow Fleet, that whole discussion about ships that are actually ready for, equipped for Arctic sailing. I think even this summer, the transit from China to Europe of a container vessel, moving the Istanbul Bridge, I believe it was called, it's not clear that that was up to polar code. Certainly the classification of ship wasn't one appropriate for there. So the impacts on, the residents, people living there, could be quite significant, given that there's a laxness, and we've seen this in other aspects of Russian policy, that they've loosened up quite a bit on environmental regulations, et cetera, which on the books in Russia are not that, or actually maybe better than you would assume, but of course the enforcement of them is clearly on the down, well, some of them have been unwound, and then enforcement in light of these, imperatives as they see it around hydrocarbon export. So that would be the main area I would point to there.
Thank you, Alexander. So I actually catched what you said about the vision, Putin's visions, about the balancing use and protection, and also caretaker of the North. It sounded very Norwegian too. Maybe Canadian too.
Yeah, I think a little less grandiose typically, but I can't speak to Norwegian politics, but in Canadian. I think it's really important to understand that the long kind of, when you read a lot of this, it's very Soviet. In some of the central planning and the notions of economic development, et cetera. And this clearly is an area where, speaking to Russians who aren't in the north, to the general Russian population south of the Arctic Circle and the Arctic zone areas, clearly has resonances for them that, that Putin is trying to tap into with those narratives.
Okay, thank you, Alexander.
My pleasure.
Have a hand for him.
Thank you.
The next one comes from Mike Knoll-Kaufmann. You're at the Norwegian Institute of Water Research. She's a senior researcher in marine coastal governance there, and you focus on the science, policy, society interface. So you will talk about distributed sense-making and risk governance in the Norwegian Arctic, navigating maritime safety in Svalbard waters. Welcome.
Yes, thank you very much for this introduction, and thanks for a very interesting keynote prior to me. My presentation is also about Arctic preparedness, but from quite a different angle. I'm talking about risk related to maritime activities in the Arctic, and the risk debate and policies around that. Let's see, yeah. So the motivation for this research, which is part of the Sudarko program, which is a From Center funded program, in which I collaborate with my collaborators from different institutions. Sorry, I should have mentioned them prior to this, from Met Norway and UIT. We focus on this increase in Arctic shipping, which we've heard about a lot, of course, during this conference. We also had a session this morning on the use and the role of AIS data in governing safe and sustainable Arctic shipping. There's an increase in Arctic shipping and happening in a dynamic risk environment, so far away from limited preparedness, infrastructures, remoteness, darkness, potentially hazardous weather and sea ice conditions, etc. So there's this shapes a debate about the risks related to shipping and safety. And we see in the Norwegian context that accidents are triggers for policy debates. What we've seen in Norway in recent years, or 2019 and 2020, were 2 accidents. One in the Norwegian Arctic of the Northguider fishing trawler, late December, in a very challenging conditions, got stuck in the ice or grounded and had to be evacuated. And then there was a Viking Sky accident, which was a big cruise vessel along the mainland coast of Norway, had engine trouble, also needed a huge preparedness or emergency operation to evacuate the vessel. And this really triggered the debate, like what happens if this happens in the Arctic, far away from search and rescue services. After this accident, the Viking Sky Cruise Committee was established by the Norwegian government, consisting of experts in search and rescue, agencies, the industry, state authorities, etc. And they had the mandate to discuss risk and safety of Arctic shipping and to propose additional measures that could be implemented in policy to make cruise activities safer. So what I'm going to talk about now is mostly related to cruise activities, but it is relevant from a wider Arctic perspective. We use a sense-making perspective, which comes from social psychology and organization studies, and we ask what can we learn from a sense-making perspective to explain these dynamics around implementing maritime safety measures in the Norwegian Arctic. But again, it has relevance beyond the Norwegian Arctic and beyond cruise activities. That's the wrong one. Sorry, struggling with my back. There. I wanted to see my own slides too, but it's a bit confusing. So distributed sense-making perspective. What's this idea about risk sense-making? Sense-making is the idea that it's a collective process of interpreting and reinterpreting risk and responding to risk. It's triggered by violated expectations, like accidents, like this Northguider or this Viking Sky accident. It treats risk management as a collective activity with multiple actors interpreting evolving uncertainties, which could be changing conditions, weather, ice conditions, changing climate conditions, changing operational conditions, or increased shipping. It highlights ongoing negotiation and reinterpretation of risk as context and information change, and emphasizes the interdependencies between these different elements in this risk sense-making figure that we use and adapted from a scholar called Jakob Tarup Espensen, who uses these different elements of sensory systems, roles and competences, and coordination and authority, and how these interact. From their interactions emerges this risk sense-making, where sensory systems can be seen as all the information, the cues that you need to understand a risk. Like, for example, weather and sea ice forecasts, AIS data, navigational information, all these kind of different conditional information. And then the roles and competences could be related to roles and competence of the crew on board a vessel, but also of search and rescue operators, of those providing information. And then the coordination networks refer to, for example, policy frameworks, what regulates risk. The Polar Code is an example here, or other national regulatory frameworks. Now I'll push the right one. Yes? So what we did is, in this Sudarko project, we put our focus on this Norwegian case study, where we used this cruise committee report as a point of departure. We selected a set of measures that we wanted to explore and reflect on how they change this idea of risk and how they're implemented. So we used these reports. We participated in a cruise conference taking place annually in Ålesund. We held a stakeholder workshop in 2023, having together different relevant stakeholders related to Arctic shipping activity in Norway, and we conducted a set of expert interviews with authorities and industry. And then we discussed, I don't know what's happening to these slides, they're changing by themselves, it seems. We discussed 3 proposed safety measures by this cruise committee: reference routes, dynamic routing restrictions, and strengthened competence requirements. Yes, thank you. Yeah. So the first one that we look at is the reference routes. And reference routes are quality assured routes that bundle navigational information, weather and sea ice information, regulatory information into one system, easily accessible for navigational purposes and route planning for operators. This was proposed by this cruise committee to implement, and the Norwegian Coastal Administration followed up and published a set of 22 reference routes for Svalbard last year. So they act as coordination tools that support shared situational awareness. From our interviews that we conducted, we had some reflections about how they, in a way, standardize information, make it available in a more standardized way, but it also really leads to reflections around what information do you offer, and how do you update that, and how often, and what does it mean in terms of flexibility in navigating in the Arctic. It also may affect traffic patterns, because decisions, of course, are made what to offer and what not to offer in terms of information, both in terms of where the information comes from, but also where on the map, which routes you choose. Some areas were not selected because of their ecological sensitivity, for example. So there's also some political decisions behind these measures. I'm really sorry for messing up here, but thank you. I'll jump over this one. And then I had one slide about these strength and competence requirements, which I won't go into now, but I can tell more about this later if needed or discuss. Then the other measure that we discussed with our stakeholders is dynamic traffic regulations. One proposed measure by this cruise committee was to implement dynamic weather-based restrictions for certain areas where hazardous conditions might take place. So exposed areas. Certain parameters were used, but no areas were designated for the Svalbard context. This was also related to vessels longer than 150 meters, which was mainly relevant for the Norwegian mainland coast. But it relies on good forecasts, of course, of certain, for example, combination of wave and wind conditions, where you could close an area for a certain amount of time when the conditions are too hazardous. increases the role of weather data and weather information as active decision-making tools, and also redistributes authority in risk policy. Again, no exposed areas for Svalbard were designated, but it really triggers a debate about should you choose certain parameters that would fit an Arctic context, and how could you, or is it desirable to do this in an Arctic context? So some final reflections. We discuss in this paper how measures interact with these sense-making processes and these different elements, the sensory systems, the crews, their roles, their competence, and the policy regulatory frameworks, and how they redistribute responsibility and what works and what not works. We see that these weather and sea ice information, they are mobilized in very different ways as possible policy tools in these different measures, but it also highlights implementation of risk and safety policy as a very ongoing and contested process. We also see that with these reference routes, implementation is most successful when these sensory systems, rules and competences and coordination systems are mostly aligned. And then as a final reflection, we see that policy both responds to these accidents and reshapes risk narratives, and it's an ongoing process. And yes, that was what I wanted to say, and I'll be happy to discuss more and answer any questions if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Maike. Is there a question for Maike from the audience? Okay, we take that during the discussion afterwards, Maike. Thank you very much. The next, just a minute. Next one is Torleif Bryne from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. You're an associate professor within estimation and navigation systems at the Department of Engineering Cybernetics at the NTNU in Norway. Also in a small satellite lab, working with unmanned aerial vehicle laboratory. What you are going to talk about is a new project funded by RCN. Absolutely. The SkyMap project, surveillance of maritime critical energy infrastructure using space-based, there you have it, multimodal and combined active and passive sensors. Welcome.
Thank you. We have actually started with changing the title of the project, but it will cover responsive and space-based maritime surveillance, multimodal active and passive sensing. It's quite a handful, but hopefully I will be able to cover it. So it will be SkyMap for short. So a little bit of the context as an engineer where I sort of come from, and I was thinking about this. So Norway has the world's second largest coastline, 13th largest economic zone. 80% of our oceans are north of the Arctic. Test. Yes, great. And a ballpark, 20 to 30% of our GDP is from the ocean economy, dependent on oil and gas prices, fish from aquaculture, and so on, and all of the other sort of associated businesses that comes from the ocean. So we have quite a bit to manage and to protect. But the idea of the project came from more and more news coming in about subsea infrastructure, critical infrastructure, sabotage, energy pipelines, energy links and communication links going down in our region. I have brought up an example of some of them. Some of them have still unknown culprits, some are known, and some have debated culprits. But there are quite a bit of them, and all of them affecting critical infrastructure, either in the Arctic or in the Nordics in large. So, a little bit of backdrop. To me, I would say I've made a rather pointed slide, perhaps over generalized, but there are changes in the Arctic, how I see it as an engineer. With the warming in the Arctic, there will be opening new opportunities, both for transportation, but also for other type of vessels. We have militarization with Russia's increased the military buildup. We have the more member states in the Nordics in NATO, and also the Greenland situation. China has also declared itself as a near polar state with their polar Silk Road. And also we have more issues now, for instance, when it comes to the governance and the Arctic Council, which has, to my understanding, been rather robust to conflicts and disagreement on other topics and other places worldwide. But now, after the invasion of Ukraine, also there is starting to break down at least part of it. So, Arctic, there are geopolitical changes in the Arctic, and in my opinion, therefore, we need more and better maritime surveillance. We have increase in dark ship activity, either sabotage or sanction breaking vessels, and we believe that space-based maritime surveillance is part of the picture and part of the solution to addressing this issue. So it's a handful of sensor modalities to pick and choose from. All of them have their strengths and their weaknesses. We will focus on a couple of them. AIS is sort of the backbone of this, but has low security and is easy to spoof and turn off. We will also focus quite a bit on the optical side in the project, and also the last point on radio frequency-based or RF-based remote sensing. And with the project partners, we will also address the middle ones, that is radar detector, classical SAR. Yeah. So a little example from our own infrastructure. So we have two research satellites made for something completely different. So for our second generation satellite, we added a RGB camera, so we could have a reference of what the hyperspectral images actually took images of. But we see that it also has a potential to be used at least as an add-on to a maritime surveillance system, because here we can clearly see a wake from a ship. Here is even more high-speed vessel, where the wake is even more clearly visible. But then, what if this was in the Arctic and it was in the wintertime? Then it would look perhaps like this, where you can only see kind of contours, given how, of course, you had configured this sensor. So why do I show this? Is just to highlight that even though it's a fantastic sensor, camera has its weaknesses. It won't see a ship if there are clouds, for instance. Yeah. So with increased dark ship activity and sabotage incidents, I think we should go for a more improved coverage and improved maritime surveillance capability in the Arctic. I heard a presentation from KSAT earlier today, and it seems like they are on board and in agreement with me there. We should add new, but hopefully cost-effective sensing to address some of the coverage gaps in existing modalities. And also so we can detect IS spoofing even better. We should detect ship traffic anomalies, for instance, suspicious behavior, similar to what has been going on in the Baltic Sea with ships trawling around looking for infrastructure to sabotage instead of doing their own business and just transporting of people and goods. We should have faster detection. So like there's a phrase from days and hours to minutes and seconds. In the Arctic is already rather good. KSAT can like deliver 20 minutes response time now in the Arctic due to the distribution of their ground network. It's not that case worldwide. But to facilitate this, we need, of course, a very good ground segment and communication, but also automated processing, tasking of upcoming satellites, and notification to the user. So the objective of our project will be to deliver a cost-effective and space-based multimodal maritime surveillance concept with a combination of sensor modalities, enhanced detection, localization and tracking of ships using a combination of edge processing, that is processing on the satellite, and also using the ground segment. And improve then coverage and reduce detection and latency through smart processing. Communication to and from the ground segment, and tasking of sensors. So I think we are very, very well positioned to deliver on this due to our, I would say, great consortium. With the expertise in all domains of space-based maritime surveillance, and especially with, I think, with KSAT's new effort on the communication side, on more responsive, with their hyper program, so they can have ground stations, so to speak, in space to reduce the communication delays. I think we're in a great position to deliver on this. So this is how we're going to work and interact and make this system. You make use of traditional sensor modalities, add new ones, especially on the radio frequency side, and interact with all of the relevant stakeholders. But it will not necessarily solve everything, so it's part of a bigger puzzle. So I still believe we should think multi-domain, make use of other type of, say, robots, and that can be traditional maritime surveillance patrol planes, it can be the Coast Guard, and so on, and also in situ infrastructure to collect relevant data. And to round off, we believe with this project that we will be improving protection of critical infrastructure and make that more easy, improve or make it easier to apply appropriate governance, increase safety, but also then help and contribute to near real-time detection and alerting of suspicious activity. And also, I do believe we're supporting the Norwegian strategy for the Arctic. So that was what I had to say.
Thank you very much. Is there a question? I have a you have a question too. I have too.
Oh, real quick, but probably maybe. Thank you for this. I was just, it's a lot of sensors, and I'm wondering what is the cost, are folks looking at the cost of implementing these systems and then the cost of what we're hoping it saves from everywhere from shipping to life to, are there economic costs in these spaces?
For sure. A big SAR satellite, I don't dare speculate on the prices, but it will be significant. So we are sort of working in the new space, so we would like rather cheap space vehicles, so we can launch a lot of them, so we can have a good coverage, but of course with the sort of cost or downside that it's not like a perfect one-for-all sensor that can do everything. So in a sense, we're trying to reduce the hardware cost for launch, so that we can have more space vehicles, and then fix all of the sort of downsides with that strategy on the software side, either on board or ground with utilization of a very good, say, communication and communication network. But hopefully, the cost of this will be very small to the potential downsides of not doing it, given the very large area compared to a number of people living in the Arctic. So yeah, I hope that answered your question at least partly. Yeah.
I was just going to quickly ask about the subsea component. You had the
Yeah.
How that figures in. Is there any thought about how it integrates with other sensor packages that are below the surface? And in general, I mean, you know, satellite technologies, what potential do they have for things that are underneath the water?
There is a lot of interesting new, say, technology that uses already existing infrastructure. For instance, subsea fiber. So you can actually, they have done tests, you can like track whales with that. Then of course you can track other type of underwater activity as well. One can at least presume. So making use of space compared with existing infrastructure, I think, unlike doing that around the clock and joining that data together and then tasking assets that are more scarce, Coast Guard, like the P8 surveillance planes, to specific locations where there is like higher probability of something fishy going on, I think is a good way to going about it. So yeah, at least we should not forget the subsea part and sensing below the sea surface.
You mentioned fishy activities, but what about fish? You address obviously critical infrastructure like energy plants and oil platforms. But what about? But you mentioned also you're capable of looking at dark ships.
Yes.
They could be fishing too, and that's also important for Norwegian surveillance systems.
So I put it in the context of only like vessel sabotaging, but of course this exact same technology can be applied to detect illegal fishery.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice. So the next talk is given by Johan Schalin. You are the Deputy Director of the Research and Analysis Function of the European Centre of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. And that sounds very interesting. And you have actually worked in the Foreign Service in just a minute. Where was it? In Finland? Yes, for many years before. That's correct. Perfect. And you are going to talk to us about preparing for hybrid threats and the strategic implications of Russian and Chinese Arctic capabilities. Thanks, Johan.
Thank you. It will be an honor to do so. And I will first say just one word about hybrid COE. We are a government-financed research and training institution. You can say a think and do tank. We do autonomous research. Our participating states are EU members and NATO allies. We have around 50 personnel and a budget of around 5 million. And our prime customers are practitioners. But we also have this research and analysis function, and I believe we also can participate in an academic discussion on hybrid threats. That's our ambition, to set the tone of the discussion, and we have some conceptual work on what we mean with hybrid threats. And let's see if I can get this work. What are hybrid threats? Maybe we're first going to present you with this outline of my presentation. So this is based on a paper that was published 2 weeks ago, desk research, and I'm going to talk to you first about Russian and Chinese intent and policies, and then about some capabilities that they are bringing up with shipping, but also other activities, space into the Arctic, and some thinking of what kind of evolving hybrid threat potential that could bring along. Yes, what is hybrid threats? So we see hybrid threats not only as cyber attacks, disinformation, and sabotage. Actually, hybrid threats span over all domains of society: cultural, societal, economic, and it mirrors, so to say, the actors' total war concept, like, or total deterrence concept. Like Russia has an idea of how they erode a country in all sectors with their economy, their political life, and so on. So this is what we research. We have defined 13 domains where this happens. You will see those domains on the last slides, but I won't list them now. And then we look at tools, which is an open list of different kinds of activities and campaigns and incidents. And maybe with those words, I will present the main points of this study, which I researched together with Sophie Arts from the German, who also serves at the German Marshall Funds of the United States. The name of the paper is there, and the number of it. So if you want to photograph and read it later, you can take a picture of this slide, or you can ask me for a hard copy. I have just a few with me. So we look at the long-term objectives of Russia and China in the Arctic. How will their capability, technology and infrastructure development and military-civil cooperation create potential for future hybrid threats? We focus on space-based surface and subsurface civilian and multipurpose capabilities for navigation and maritime research, and that enhance situational awareness. Multipurpose, because we usually say dual use, but that's military language. In hybrid threats, it's not only the military threats, it's also the non-military threats, therefore we use multipurpose capabilities. We have a thesis, which is difficult to test because the future will tell, but we believe that the capabilities that are evolving in the Arctic can be weaponized for hybrid threats in the future. They will, if China and Russia gets an advantage in the sort of censoring and communication and positioning and all kinds of capabilities in the Arctic, they can also create dependencies. They could target local populations and have an advantage in the information space and data. Like, for instance, we see that China is gaining in Africa at this time as we speak. And we call for more cooperation and coordination among democratic countries, engagement with indigenous rights holders and other local stakeholders. So the first section, how is PRC and Russia cooperating in the Arctic security landscape? So, first of all, they have conflicting visions, which is important to remember. For Russia, the Arctic has an economy. Russia has an economy based on resource extraction and raw material exports, and is reliant on the Arctic for its future economies, including the seabed. Russia exploits its privileged geographical position and aims to prevent internationalization of the resources that it controls and the territories. Russia tries to diversify its cooperation to other friendly and BRICS countries, apart from China also, not wanting to be dependent on China only. Russia has amended its Arctic strategies and renewed its foreign policy concept after the Ukrainian full-scale invasion to reflect this last point. And the Arctic for China is, of course, increased access to Arctic plays into its long-term strategic objectives. So they need future supplies, access to critical commodities, and they are investing in critical projects. They see also the high seas of the Arctic as a part of the global commons, where they could perhaps in the very far future fish protein or mine the seabed. They also look at it through the connectivity lens because they are interested in the polar Silk Road, because they feel that the United States can close the Malacca Straits from trade, and they feel enclosed by this threat. And they want situational awareness. They think their doctrine lists the polar areas among the commanding heights of the future security landscape, and they want a stepping stone to space in which Arctic is a very good resource. And China is determined to increase its say in Arctic governments, whether it be within regional arrangements, bilaterally or through multilateral organizations. Okay, slightly closer look at PRC's Arctic policies and strategies. PRC defines the strategic new frontiers of future conflict, and we're talking military here: outer space, cyberspace, the deep sea, and both polar regions. That's their list of 4. The science of military strategy, which is not actually an official policy document, but more of a think tank document by the think tanks, the strategists closest to the government. They have a chapter on military conflict in polar regions, and they define Arctic, as I said, as the strategic commanding heights of the northern hemisphere. Military in the Arctic is still subordinated to civilian research, shipping, search and rescue, etc. But on the other hand, in the Chinese thinking, civilian activities can pave the way for naval capabilities to be and military presence to be sort of primed in the Arctic. And there's a quote there. Oh, sorry. I'm actually not advancing for you as fast as I advance myself. Okay, so I told you all of this. And there is one thinker who said it very clearly, which we quote there. And Russia-PRC cooperation has evolved tremendously since around 12 years or so, accelerated in 2023-24 with new agreements. There's been joint scientific research expeditions since 2016. There are commercial, security, science, tech cooperation in the Arctic maritime subsea space science spheres, domains. And this is driven by the top level of government. And it increasingly involves sensitive technologies and security cooperation, which indicates that prior distrust is giving way. The cooperation is highly asymmetric. Isolation makes Russia more dependent on China. And Russia, of course, alone controls its territory and maritime areas. Controlling the NSR, as we heard today, is a core national interest of Russia. And for China, shipping is a way to establish presence, develop dual-use technology, and to diversify trade routes. I'm looking a little bit on the capabilities side, 3 slides on that. First on Arctic shipping. So in Arctic shipping, Russia has given China preferential stake in the Northern Sea Route, which normalizes Chinese presence. Since 2023, there is a Coast Guard cooperation with joint patrols from 2024. First meeting of a Russia-PRC subcommittee on the Northern Sea Route took place in late 2024. And our thesis is that shipping is becoming a vehicle for introducing multipurpose capabilities in the Arctic. Shipping requires positioning and communication with coverage adapted for high latitudes, assets for search and rescue, remote sensing capabilities to monitor shipping and ice conditions. And all these support superior monitoring and are likely to enable future hybrid threats to an advantage or dominance in information, logistics, communications, and data flows. In 2025, there was also a Chinese container line service and a Chinese ice monitoring service advertised. Secondly, Arctic science. PRC has done expeditions since the 1990s. In the 2018 Arctic White Paper, China stresses Arctic science as important. It has grown in volumes to 4th in rank globally, and it serves, for instance, collection of multi-purpose data, and it serves also soft power. Arctic research is done by PRC universities that are very close to the defense industry. From 2023, the PRC is Russia's first partner for scientific research outputs. In 2023, Russia announced a new International Arctic Science Center on Norwegian Svalbard and invited BRICS plus friendly countries to join. And they claimed they had interested countries for that. The PRC operates 5 ice-breaking research vessels by now. Example missions have tested uncrewed submersibles, collected topographic data, and installed unmanned sea and subsea and acoustic observation equipment. No time to go deeper into that, but this is done by the universities who are clearly dual use. In the space domain, China is expanding its infrastructure of polar satellites to gain access to situational awareness via space. They develop independent satellite capabilities that support Arctic operations, independent from Western systems, that is, strengthen the global reach of its navigation system, and collect and nationally control data to alter the terms of knowledge production and intervene in regional governance. We have Space Work Strand at the Hybrid COE has looked more deeply into this way of using space by China. There's a Chinese constellation of planned for 24 optical imagery satellites by 2030. Here they come in funny order. Last edits. Yeah, the first Ice Pathfinder has a superior wide field view. Track ships that have enabled its transponders. And Russia has both an Earth observation satellite program for the Arctic, especially for the Arctic under construction, and a communication satellite constellation, which is dual use. Russia-PRC cooperation in space is also close. A joint committee was already from 2015 on major strategic cooperation projects in satellite navigations, and 2022 contracts to host ground stations for navigation, military and civilian purposes. And then a few final slides on possible hybrid threat potential. So if we first look at physical, cyber and electronic operations, more maritime traffic may cause potential for accidents, environmental disasters or sabotage, including against undersea infrastructure. Undersea infrastructure protection by situational awareness is important, increased resilience and repair capabilities adapted for the Arctic. Russia, of course, has a great territory in the Arctic, practically half the Arctic coastline, more, and a great advantage in physical Arctic infrastructure, ports, search and rescue assets, dual-use icebreakers, and a greater military presence. All of this creates hybrid threat potential. Hybrid threat activities in space could include inhibited or stopping data flows to or from space and between the suppliers and customers, harming ground stations, antenna systems and connections, injecting software bugs, and executing encryption attacks. Remote sensing satellite sensors, hydrophones, ground and science stations, all used to collect weaponizable information, including personal situational awareness data. Actually, China is harvesting personal data by cyber attacks in all domains. And these are becoming exploitable for influencing and interference in local, national and regional decision making. I promised that my last slide would show you our 13 domains, and we're at the last slide. So this is actually a model we created in something called a core model, the model for comprehensive resilience, where we visualize hybrid operations with a dartboard. The inner core is the democratic institutions and core values. The first circle is the local governance level. The second circle is the national. The third, the international. And then there are three spaces, which you can see here. Not easy to see here. Actually, you only see them through three lines. One which comes through the political domain, and two lines that come from the down left and right. And these are the governance space to the upright. It's the services space at the bottom, and the civil space at the top left. And this picture is taken, is not taken from, but it is constructed on a report on northern Norway, what Russia has done in northern Norway the last 5 to 10 years. All these domains have been exploited. We could not find examples from space and economy, but all the other ones are clearly exploited. The darkest targeted is the local civil space with a lot of history, memorial policies, influencing local populations, but also very much the governance space with intelligence, GPS spoofing, and cyber attacks are there, and of course infrastructure sabotage. And the idea with a hybrid threat is not the single incidents, but it is the combined effects which are cascading from the local to the national, from the national to the international, and also around this circle. And this circle believed that the ultimate goal of all of these attacks on northern Norway is the national Norwegian governance space. They want to keep NATO out of northern Norway, want to intimidate Norway. But going back to the text, we have seen cultural and socio-economic influencing in other theaters, like in Asia, in Caucasus, Eastern Europe. We have documented them in two working papers, one on the Canadian Arctic and one on the Norwegian High North. We know that campaigns in the future may exploit conflicts of interest and push divisive narratives with local populations. They can drive wedges between local constituencies and national decision-making, amplify historical grievances, which come from a colonial past, and malign actors could in the future create dependencies in provisional services, like I already mentioned. I already mentioned briefly the recommendations in the beginning, but we recommend more cooperation, more whole-of-society approach to resilience, more partnerships, civil, military, public, private, inclusive policy making with stakeholders, cooperation and coordination among democratic governments, pooling resources, sharing best practices, coordinating responses, and trusted partnerships and collaborative resilience. With those words, I think I will finish, and thank you for your attention. I have a few hard copies of this report, otherwise it's on the internet, and our research will continue in the Arctic. This is something like the 6th report on the Arctic, I think, 5th or 6th, and it will continue this year as well and next year. It's a work strand. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice talk. Is there a question in the audience? Yes, there is.
Thank you so much. I was maybe going to ask this question to Alexander earlier as well. We all know Russia has wonderful form for over-exaggerating its capabilities and also for a lot of its various kinds of military capabilities to actually be in very poor shape, very poorly maintained, poorly crewed, maintained, all of these things. How do you see that playing out in this particular scenario? As you mentioned, Russia has more infrastructure than China does, but where do you see the holes in their capabilities from that neglect of their capabilities?
But can you repeat the first part of the question? You say what Russia has.
Russia has form for over-exaggerating what its capabilities are.
Ah, yeah.
When in reality they are
Yeah.
not kept in good shape.
Yes, that's true. So, for instance, it's clear in the Arctic that they have an advantage in icebreakers, for instance, a huge fleet which the West has difficulties to match. They have an advantage in ports and shipping. But, for instance, the space capabilities, even if I listed them here, are not actually very impressive. And this is one, they have the know-how, but they don't have the resources. Another thing they don't have is a shipping industry, so they can barely build the icebreakers they need, but they cannot build the commercial ships that they would need to actually take up into the Northern Sea route. And they need ships with ice-enforced construction, and there's not enough of them. So they're trying to build partnerships with a lot of countries to build more of these Arctic adapted ships. I don't think it's a secret. I mean, they're not exaggerating this. It's in the open. But what more? Yes, it's true. They might exaggerate something. It's part of the game, I think, to intimidate.
Could I ask, since we had in this session a presentation from Canada and Europe and Finland, or Europe perspective, is there room here for more collaboration between Canada and Europe and the Nordic countries?
Yes, I do believe. By the way, Canada is a participating state in the hybrid COE. Yeah. So we are not, even if you have a European in the name, we're not all European. And we also have partnerships with Asia. Well, at least ad hoc partnerships. We're talking to the Japanese and so on. But there is room for more, certainly for more cooperation. Conditions in Canadian Arctic is very different from Tromsø, as we know. Extremely sparsely populated, very harsh weather. So the challenges are slightly different, but on a policy level and on capabilities, pooling resources, exchanging information, there's a lot of scope. But sorry, I think this was meant to both of us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's different capabilities on each side. I mean, I think from a policy perspective, certainly the Canadian discussion around involvement of Indigenous Canadians in defence and security and economic development in the North is much more explicit. Would say there's still an enormous amount of work to do. Whereas the discussion in Northern Europe, I think around civil defence, comprehensive security, total defence, these concepts is actually much more advanced. So I think there's some comparative advantages that Canada and certainly the Nordic countries and more broadly with the EU and NATO can share in that respect. I mean, it's worth pointing out that the current Canadian government has pushed Nordic relations quite strongly, you know, a very comprehensive strategic partnership with Sweden, also one with Finland, involvement with Denmark and Norway on maritime security issues. So I suspect more of that is coming. And of course, the Greenland issue is one that's of, you know, very large strategic interest to Canada, not just because of proximity geographically, but also culturally, and in terms of Indigenous self-determination. I mean, the peoples of Nunavut and Inuit Nunangat, the larger Inuit homeland, are you know, closely linguistically related to Greenlandic Inuit.
So give a hand to the last session, please, to all the speakers. So by that, I will close these three sessions, really high tide for Arctic preparedness. I guess next year there will be also a tide related to Arctic preparedness. Please remember that there is a poster session from 5:30 until 19, and then after that it's a science reception for those that have buy tickets for it. And the poster session is with even more presentations on posters at the Saga Hotel after from 5:30 until 7 o'clock. So thanks for joining, and thanks to all the speakers.